So
Right.
how do your works and reflections connect to the field of sociology of language?
So I think the only way to start this conversation is by saying how I connected to Fishman personally and professionally, right? I was a young scholar. I didn't know too much about the world. I had been quite constrained by just being a New Yorker, a Cuban New Yorker, born in Cuba, but living in New York City since the age of 11. And I obtained a postdoctoral fellowship to study with Joshua Fishman at Yeshiva University, I think in 1982. And to me, that was life-changing. Why was it life-changing? Because of Fishman's idea. He was an intellectual giant who really, at a time in which there was no internet and no ability to connect with other scholars, he also always connected to the world, knew a lot about the languages of the world, knew a lot about the diversity of languages. And this all came from his own experience as a child. I mean, he always talked about the way he started becoming interested in all of this was because he had a stamp collection back then when children used to collect stamps. And he became interested in the places that the stamps came from. And of course, language had also been a very important part of his world. He was born in Philadelphia of parents who spoke Yiddish. They were secular Jews. They were not Orthodox. And went to a camp for leftist socialist Jews in Philadelphia, which I think was a big movement back then. Met his future wife, Gela, there, who was also a Yiddish activist. So language and identity were always a very important part of his upbringing. But I think what made Fishman important was that he not only cared about himself, that is his own identity, but he projected his interest in language and identity onto others. And he was always curious about the other. He wanted to always know a little bit more about the rest of us. So I always say that everything I know about language, I learned in Fishman 101, right? He taught me, he gave me the best lesson in life, which was that every generation has to make sense for themselves, and every people have to make sense for themselves. And that gave me also freedom then to take all the ideas and all the intellectual work that I had learned from working alongside him, with him and alongside him for many, many years, and think about how it applied or not to my own work. And I'm sort of grateful that even the translanguaging work, that was developed in his late years of life, but I was able to dedicate my book, Bilingual Education in the 21st Century, to him, and discuss the ideas of translanguaging with him. And by then, it was 2009, I had not quite developed where I am with translanguaging today, but he could see it. He could see how the germs are in his ideas, but yet extended in ways forward. So I don't know if you want me to say more, but I can talk and talk. So I rather that you ask me some questions, and then we'll, I'll try to think of what's different. Yeah.
Perfect. And how do you see the expansion of the field of sociology of language and of Fishman's idea outside the Euro-American scholarship, for example, in the Hispanic academic world?
So I think, I think it's interesting because you mentioned above before, Fishman always complained that his sense of sociolinguistics he always used to talk about three legs, and I can't remember the third one, but one was linguistics, the other one was sociology, and maybe the other one was psychology. I can't remember. And he would say, well, what happened with sociolinguistics is that it was in some way separated from the social, right? So I think his sense from the very beginning was not to have only one discipline, sociolinguistics, but because of Labov's influence, I think the linguistic part was more emphasized than the social part. And he always really thought of having a balance between the social and the linguistics. So some people sort of shun him from sociolinguistics and put him in a box of sociology of language and not sociolinguistics. But to him, it was always sociolinguistics. It was the idea that language could not be divorced or separated from the world, the social, the political. It was always there. So that's interesting. I think from the beginning, his scholarship was better known outside of the United States than sometimes in the United States. For example, there were minoritized groups in the 1980s. I'm thinking of the Maoris of New Zealand and the Basques in Spain, who frequently used Fishman's scholarship to gain their language rights, right? So I know the Maoris, especially in New Zealand, had a very strong relationship with Fishman's scholarship and with him personally. And he didn't, his later life, he didn't visit as much, but they came regularly. Even to his apartment at the end. He retired early. He retired at 55 because he wanted to really dedicate the rest of the years he had to his scholarship and to writing. And the teaching was never, because it's interesting when there's a major figure like this, you think that they had a lot of resources, right? Oh, a lot of resources. That's not the case at all. Fishman worked at Yeshiva University, which was a Jewish Orthodox university, in a department of developmental psychology. And he felt alienated there. He felt that the psychologists were really not interested in the work on bilingualism and language and society that he was conducting. And he tried different things. For example, when I came into the picture, it was in the mid-1980s. It was because he had gotten a grant to train developmental psychologists as multilingual experts so that they would think about the work that they're doing in relationship to language and minoritized populations. You asked me about outside of the United States, and I've gone elsewhere. But anyway, the other place that I think regularly visited him and regularly, that he really felt that he had an impact on was in the Basque Country. I don't know whether it was good or bad, but I think at that point of their development, when they were, coming out of a dictatorship that had made their use of language illegal, and where they wanted to reverse the language shift that was taking place, I think that Fishman's ideas about how to really promote the language, never the language by itself, but the language in relationship to peoplehood. What does it mean to a people to continue to speak a language? What sense of identity does that create? So I think that definitely in Spain, especially the Basques, but also to some extent the Gallegos, and to lesser extent the Catalans, because they had more resources. Fishman always worked with and was always interested in what he used to call the little people, those without power, basically. So in the United States, Native Americans, in Latin America, also Native Americans, and in the United States, also the Latino world became important to him. He, he edited a book early on, I can't remember the year, but maybe in 1990 or so, on bilingual education for Hispanics, right? That's what it was called, I think, with Gary Keller. That was about paying attention to the Hispanic population, what he called the Hispanic population in the United States, and the social inequalities that they were experiencing, and then the type of education that he thought they would have to have. And yet, he was always critical, for example, of the way in which bilingual education was institutionalized. And I did not understand that for years. Sometimes you read and work with an idea and you don't understand it right away. It's become clearer and clearer to me as the bilingual education development has happened in the United States, because it's been basically taken away from the people and put as something that may be good for the dominant majority English-speaking world, but not really with thinking about the minoritized population, race, etc. So I think that he was always very close. And like I say, that program that he started on bilingual education for a developmental bilingual, I don't know, bilingual developmental psychology, I think it was called. I mean, we trained around 20, 25 developmental psychologists, or Latinos, all Latinos. And for those people, that some of them I'm still in touch with, the experience was transformational, because they never did the psychological work with Hispanic populations anymore, thinking of them as deficient in language, but thinking of their bilingualism as an asset that had not really cognitive benefits, but especially socio-emotional benefits that were important to their identity and their lives in the United States.
Yes, you have been mentioning the role of psychology and the relation between Fishman and psychology, developmental psychology. How do you see the interdisciplinarity of this field of sociology of language today?
Yeah, I think that, something that you should know is that he trained as a social psychologist back in the late 60s. So that's what his PhD is about, except his dissertation was on Yiddish, right? He was a friend of the Weinreichs, both Uriel and Max Weinreich, right, who were always also Yiddishists. So I think he had grown up with them, gone to camp with them, gone to school with them. So I think in his home, there was always a sense, and now I've forgotten what you asked, but I don't know where I'm going with this because I forgot what you asked. But there was always a sense of commitment to language, right? I know it was the psychology part.
Yes,
and he always used to. I remember him telling me that his father always used to ask every day, "What have you done for Yiddish today?" So his father was a language activist, and this was a language activism that he passed on to Joshua Fishman, Schickel, as the friends used to call him in Yiddish. And the social psychology part, I think the social weighed more than the psychology part. But definitely, you're talking about interdisciplinarity. I think that difference between the Lavovian sociolinguistics, for example, and the Fishmanian sociolinguistics is that his approach has always been more interdisciplinary, bringing in lenses from sociology, from political science, right? All the work on nation building, etc., is from political science, from linguistics, and from psychology. So all the work on language attitudes, for example, right, which was a big part of his work, that was all, you know, the psychology interest of him. And education, you know, which is incredible, because some people, sociolinguists, sometimes are interested in mostly language, sometimes social factors, but never a macro aspect. And he always thought that it was important to balance the macro with the micro, that it couldn't be done, it couldn't be, that the understanding the world couldn't be done at one level. And he always tried to balance all these things out. You know, and if you look at his work in its entirety, what you find is you have work on education, lots of work on bilingual education early on, work that is more about language policy and language planning, which is more oriented to both corpus planning and status planning. You have then work on language and ethnicity and identity, which is, you know, more emotions, whatever, and work on language attitudes. I would think those are the prongs that he always sort of balanced, and he brought them into the study of one particular case. So, you know, that's what I can say about the interdisciplinarity. It's all there from the very beginning. It was about his life, you know. It was always about, it's like the rest of us, right? It was always about trying to understand his life, and that of others through the understandings that he had gained as a person. You know, his linguistics training was late. His linguistics training was not until he became a friend of Charles Ferguson, and he started taking linguistics courses with Ferguson. And they were very close, and Ferguson taught him a lot about linguistics. But of course, you know, this was someone that already had a curiosity about language, both structural and the connections to questions of identity and nationalism, etc. So, you know, that's also interesting that it came late academically. It did not come late as far as an interest that he always grew up with, right? And that he always watched for. Yeah.
Perfect. Yes. And what do you think, what would be today, for example, the main topics, themes, or methodologies involved in sociology of language, in your perspective?
Topics and themes. I think those topics that I mentioned are still grounded in Fishman's work, right? The idea of, and I think we've gone beyond some of it, but it's all grounded in that work, right? Language policy and language planning. We've left planning behind. And as a matter of fact, in his late life, he was always very upset that students don't think that language could be planned, right? Right. No, language cannot be planned. But, you know, the language policy work, I think, has always been, was always important. It continues, and in different kinds of ways, and it was always grounded in his work. I want to say about language policy, now that I think of it, that he was also a very good friend both of Bernard Spolsky and of Robert Cooper, right? I always think of them as the Jewish trio, the Jewish Trinity, right, in some way, because I think they developed that field together. Of course, Bob Cooper died early, Fishman died later, and Spolsky just passed away this year. And I think Spolsky was able to then extend the language policy work beyond language management and considering also the use of people. But I think, you know, you also have to think of the times, and I think I think of this very carefully because I have young scholars, young scholars, very good scholars, who are always who cannot think of ideas and historical times, right? So I mean, I think we have to remember that all this field of language planning, language policy was evolved, developed during a historical time in which there was just beginning the independence of African and Asian nations. And yes, we were imposing, and I think he himself says it. As a matter of fact, I can read something from his his words. We were imposing our epistemologies on them. And Fishman never spoke about decolonial anything because it wasn't his time. But I think from the very beginning he thought about what would these people think about what we're saying that they should be doing. Maybe they shouldn't be doing this. Let me see if I can find something that I thought that I always that I always talk about when I talk about this, but I never. Oh, here it is. So he talks about letting these people speak their own words or disclose their own hearts and minds. Fishman, 1996. That was late, but anyway, it's you know, it's this idea of the Mignolo's locus of enunciation, right? Said in different ways because it was that historical time, but he was always aware of this. So I think the language policy, language planning is an important topic that is still very relevant, and even if it has gone other ways. He was particularly interested in language maintenance, language shift, reversing language shift, and you know, not that I work with those constructs anymore, because I think that they could be more generative, and I can tell you a little bit about that. But I do think that they were important concepts then, when no one was talking about the defense of the rights, linguistic rights of minoritized populations, and especially because the reversing language shift shows his social activism. He wasn't just content with describing maintenance and shift. He wanted to reverse it, right? So that JID's scale that he developed, which has lots of issues, but still, you know, it was what are the steps that one needs to take to reverse this loss that we're experiencing, right? And just to say a word about the ways I think in which we extend the work, right? I like to speak of language sustainability and not language maintenance, because the minute you talk about language maintenance, people are talking about a structure, an entity that's autonomous, detached from the ways that people speak it. So I think those are concepts that, again, need some push, but certainly the thinking comes from those very important concepts, and the social activism also, right? I think the bilingual education topic is also one to which, you know, I return over and over again, and I wouldn't have been able to do any of my work in bilingual education without what he inspired and what he created, even if my push today is for more flexibility. So I think those are important themes. And in terms of methodology, it's also interesting because Fishman was a quantitative researcher at first, right? I remember, when I got there, he said, well, you have to learn how to do quantitative methodology. And, he sent me to the Institute for Political and Social Science Research at the University of Michigan to learn how to do quantitative research. And, I came back and I never did it again because it didn't fit my personality. It was not something I wanted to do, but yet, I was able to understand the issues, and he understood the issues also. He knew about psychometrics. I mean, I took courses with him on test construction, validity, reliability, all of these psychometric issues that he had to teach to the developmental psychologists that he was working with. But he was more interested in, he also worked with medical anthropologists. He was more interested in that than in the psychometric nature of tests. And I tell you this because he was good with numbers, right? And he did this before we had SPSS and SAS. He did this by hand, and he did it without assistance. People now, young scholars, think they deserve this and they deserve that. I used to say, all right, Fishman used to go to the post office every day himself and pay for the stamps because Yeshiva wouldn't give him anything. So they never paid for a conference. That was just the way it was back then. But if you want to do the work, you do the work. I don't know what else I wanted to tell you. What was I talking about, Cristine?
Yes, about methodologies.
Methodology. Oh, okay. I know what I wanted to tell you. But he was not that respectful of methodology either. He always used to tell me, if you want to get a proposal funded, you have to do the research first and then write the proposal to do the research, because then you really know what you're doing. And he always said, my work is advocacy work. I start with a position. I don't start, it's not, the research that I do is not simply objective. My research has a purpose, and the purpose is to highlight the issue of language and social well-being for different populations. So I'm committed to that, and I'm not going to in any way apologize for that. And that was to me an incredible attitude. Here's another one. Here's another quote, because I have this article in front of me. He's talking about researchers, and he says, the researchers he's talking about, they cannot wait until the best of all possible worlds comes to pass, for it never will. So they try to conduct their studies as best they can. And that, to me, has been so influential, right? You can't have it all. You just have to do the best you can. If you have a commitment, if you have a passion, you do it as best you can. You can't wait. Here's a quote about the interdisciplinarity that you were asking me before. The sociology of language must be much more vigorously in touch with social and comparative history, with social geography, and with political science than with linguistics. So, he always had this sense that we had to move there. I'm thinking the whole trend of the politics of language, or the glottopolitica that is being done in a lot of Latin America, was there already. He was always aware of that. And there was a quote that I like, but I'm not going to find right now because I'm not. Oh, here's something that also always amazes me. So he's talking about bilingual education, and he starts by saying, this is a partisan volume. None of this bullshit, being impartial. No. and partial. Not only is it unabashedly in favor of bilingual education, but it is strongly in favor of a certain context for bilingual education, a context that values it as enrichment for one and all. So, you know, he's from the very beginning, he's not he's not apologetic about his being partisan for one thing or the other. Oh, and here's another thing on methodology, which I like, another quote. I feel strongly that there is more out there, even more to the sociology of language than science can grasp. And I have a personal need for poets, artists, mystics, and philosophers too, for a deeper understanding of all that puzzles me, right? So here is someone that, you know, never just was led by numbers, but always thought of what do the numbers say, and how could I bring these other perspectives into the interpretation of the numbers? Yeah.
Yes, lovely, perfect. And finally, could you share with us a few works from Fishman that you would recommend? Maybe some works that have influenced you so much in your career, and you could recommend to someone who wants to know more about sociology of language and Fishman's works and ideas?
One work. Let's see. There's so much. I'm looking at my bookshelf. You know, I think that there is a volume that Multilingual Matters put out, which is called Language and Ethnicity in Minority Sociolinguistic Perspective. It was a 1989 publication. But I think here you will find, I think, the major articles that I think have been important, and he divides them into what is ethnicity and how is it linked to language. Second section, language maintenance, language shift. Third section, the ethnic dimension of language planning. Fourth section, language and ethnicity in education. The next section, elites and rank and file, ethno-linguistic behavior and attitudes in contrast. The sixth section, ethno-linguistic homogeneity and heterogeneity. And I think those, to me, this is a collection that he himself shows, and it's a collection of articles that I think have been very influential. And the other thing that I could recommend is some of us did some books on the occasion of its 80th birthday, and I have an essay that's called Fishmanian Sociolinguistics, 1949 to the present. I can give you the bibliographical reference later, Cristine. And I think that is a sort of I've been reading some of the sections from this essay because I always, you know, this was my work, and the way in which I interpreted his ideas and his own words. So I think that that's also important as a summary of the work.
That's perfect, Professor Ofelia. So many thanks for sharing with us your experience. And,
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Cristine.